capitalism, the nature of a world food economy in the most recent period of capitalism are also much contested between Marxism and various currents of populism. Now let me just say something about populism, because it became clear to me, at least when I'd finished the manuscript, that this was one of the underlying preoccupations in how I wrote the book. What I mean by populism in this context is the advocacy of the intrinsic values and interests of small producers, both artisans and peasants, as emblematic of the people, which is what populus means in Latin. And populism, championing the interests and the values and so on of small producers, arises time and again as an ideology and movement of opposition to the changes brought about by capitalism. This was true in both the original centres of accumulation, Northwestern Europe and North America, and those other regions of the world exposed to the effects of capitalism through their integration in its expanding world economy, from 19th century Russia, which produced some of the greatest populist writings concerning the peasantry, across the south of today. Agrarian populism in particular is the defence and advocacy of peasant or family farmers against the threats to their reproduction by capitalism and its class agents. Those might be merchants or banks or capitalist landowners or agrarian capital or agribusiness, but also the threats to their reproduction posed or imposed by projects of state-led national development in all their capitalist, nationalist and socialist variants. And the big shadow hanging over this historically was, of course, the Soviet collectivization of agriculture in the 1930s, and which produced, I think, one of the finest books, statements of agrarian populism by, I think, a Romanian scholar, David Mitrani, famous book called Marx Against the Peasant. So that was Mitrani, was very clear that here there was an unbridgeable tension in practice as in theory between Marxist views of such questions and those of populism. Now, that may sound a bit abstract, but it's actually very real for me, because I think that critical investigation and public debate today of pressing issues of farming, food, agriculture and the environment in the neoliberal globalized world we inhabit is informed and driven much more by populism than Marxism. In other words, populism is more popular than Marxism amongst those who question the current capitalist world economy. So, I suspect that many of the prospective audience for this book are likely to be attracted by the undoubted oppositional vitality of current populist positions on agribusiness, ecology, and the like. Now, it's also my view that, unfortunately, that oppositional vitality, no to globalization, no to agribusiness, and so on, often goes with a rather simplistic intellectual position. This is a point at which lots of people start to boo and hiss. But not all, I have to say, certainly not all. I mean, the best book I know on the global food economy, certainly as an introductory text, great for students, great for all of us, is by a young Canadian called Tony Weiss. And it's a wonderful book. He is a kind of populist. He and I correspond, we argue, we debate with each other, and I respect him very much. So I'm not being dismissive. The challenge in terms of audience, how to write for activists who are unfamiliar with modes of discourse common in academic exchange, and who therefore have to be persuaded of the relevance of anything I might say to their own analyses struggles and practices. That's a very, very big challenge. In the end, I decided to write a primarily theoretical text because of my belief that its audience, its target audience, is unlikely to know much or any materialist political economy and is capable of benefiting from an accessible introduction to it. Readers who persevere would then be able to test political economy expressed in the book, test it for themselves, and study it further if convinced of its utility to them. So I tried to achieve this in several ways, which I'll come back to, but in the next part of this talk, I want to try to summarize some of the highlights of the book, or some of the distinctive features of how I constructed it. So first there's an introduction, and this includes a brief discussion of why common terms that are used all the time, like peasants, small-scale farmers, family farmers, and so on, are so problematic, both conceptually and empirically, and especially when those terms are used interchangeably, which is very, very common. Peasants, family farmers, small farmers, all the same. And I then move on in the introduction to say, well, why do I frame this discussion of agrarian change in the modern world within Marx's political economy of capitalism and its development? And this is really setting up issues I return to later in the book, at least more explicitly later on. Are peasants, are small-scale farmers, are family farmers, are they a class? And what does that mean? And what's the significance of that question? It's very, very important for political economy. When I taught undergraduates at SOAS, I lectured on some of these issues, and I used to start lecture by saying, who is in favour of peasants? And the students, but then eventually quite a few hands went up. Yes, we like peasants. Why do you like peasants? Well, peasants are nice. I said, I've known some very nice peasants. I've also known some quite nasty peasants. They're like everyone else, same mix of nice and nasty. But what do they represent in sociological, socioeconomic terms? What does this mean in class terms? So that's how I set the thing up. And then the next chapter is, I think actually, I must say, rather good outline of some of the key concepts of political economy, big concepts. And I have a glossary in the book of all the key conceptual terms used in it. And it's a wonderful discipline for an author to have to do that, to explain clearly to an audience that perhaps is just beginning in the study of this area what these terms mean, how they relate to each other, and so on. And at the end of that chapter, I do something that I also rather like, which is to summarize the whole history of political economy in terms of 4 questions. And those 4 questions, and I think all political economy is about this, all the volumes that would fill this lecture theatre many times over are actually about 4 key questions. Who owns what? Who does what? Who gets what? How are the fruits of labour distributed? And what do they do with it?